Opportunity. So my title is a little different than what's in the agenda, but it's going to talk a lot about precision conservation in here. We're going to talk a little bit about this idea of prioritizing private lands to optimize biodiversity conservation. And so we're going to start off here, and let's see if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of our traditional conservation enrollment, and talk briefly about some of the challenges you may face when you kind of build it, put that habitat in the landscape, and you don't see the response. And what do? And how we potentially can leverage precision conservation delivery in that kind of a multi-scale approach to address some of those concerns. Before I get into that, I wanted to acknowledge my lab here, the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab, or as we refer to it as the AWESM Lab. Our lab really focuses on kind of these innovative solutions, developing those solutions for the growing wildlife conservation needs that we face here, especially in the Midwest, but around the world, where we're trying to deal with wildlife conservation, natural resource conservation, and agricultural production. So again, you can follow us at the AWESM Lab on our various social media outlets. All right, so we're going to talk briefly about targeted conservation or traditional conservation enrollment before we get into the targeted version of that. So typically when we think about conservation enrollment, whatever that may be, whether it's CRP, whether it's some other various conservation program, what we see is we see patches that are allocated in somewhat of a kind of a shotgun pattern. They're kind of sporadic across the landscape. They may not necessarily be very targeted. And there's various reasons as to why that actually occurs. So the question though is what happens, and I've heard this from a number of biologists, is the response from landowners, hey, we put, say, for example, some CRP acres on my property, but I'm not seeing that response that I was expecting. I was expecting to have pheasants or quail or whatever, but I'm not seeing that response. What do I need to do? And so again, what happens? Like, how do you try to address that when you're dealing with the landowner when you don't necessarily see that response? And so we're going to kind of take a simple example to kind of illustrate that. And so obviously we'll just kind of use CRP as a program, but I'm just thinking conservation enrollment in general. So for example, a landowner goes into an FSA office, they want to enroll in a conservation program. They send a biologist out to meet with the landowner to kind of look at what's potentially eligible in their property, what programs could really fit their property. And in doing so, that landowner decides to enroll a portion of their land in the CP33 program, which is the habitat buffers for upland birds. So they do that, enroll that land, but then they come back to you later on and say, hey, I've done what you told me to do, but I'm not seeing more of, you name it. So that pheasants, quail, whatever, and whatever their focus species or kind of focal species as a whole really were, how do you respond to that? And so as a biologist, that's really important in thinking about, well, there's probably various reasons as to why that something's going on there. And so again, thinking about that response and how you're going to engage with those individuals on the ground and understanding the challenges that they're facing and trying to figure out some solutions that are a way to resolve some of those issues that they're having on the ground. One of the things I wanted to think about and want you to think about is kind of thinking beyond that initial patch. So thinking about patch connectivity, thinking about how big that patch is on the landscape. So we'll take this patch, for example, that's producer enrolled. Well, when we look in the surrounding landscape, most of that is in intensive agriculture. And especially in today's world, there's not a lot of understory habitat per se available for various other wildlife species to live in there. And so again, landscape context is critical. We have to think about how those patches are allocated on the landscape. So we can think about potentially implementing corridor conservation across the landscape and thinking more broadly than that individual patch. I think that's really one of the most critical things I want you guys to take from this presentation is thinking beyond the patch and thinking about that landscape structure around that patch and why that's important. So now we're going to jump into this idea of precision conservation and think about how can we leverage precision conservation to address those issues that we just mentioned about on the landscape. And like I said, there's going to be various reasons but why that may be going on, and maybe just you just don't have the habitat necessarily, the structure there for that species of interest. But I really think one of the big challenges that we see, especially in these very highly fragmented agricultural landscapes, is that connection, this patch connectivity, and thinking really beyond that patch is such a critical aspect that is really important when we think about conservation for various species on the landscape. And that's why I titled my talk, really focusing on biodiversity conservation. It's not we're just out for pheasant conservation, or we're not out for deer, managing for deer in a property or whatever. We're thinking about the system as a whole. So we're thinking about all these various threatened and endangered species. We're thinking about kind of how can we manage best on the landscape and more strategically given what we have in our resources available. So what is precision conservation for those who are not familiar? It's really an approach in my mind to kind of assist our biologists or agencies with allocating and funding on the landscape to encourage private landowners to implement conservation actions that really can help them not only boost the overall conservation of natural resources on their farms, but really get after increasing their whole field or whole farm profitability. So if there's ways we can kind of find, kind of bridge that gap between the agricultural production side, natural resource conservation side, that's what we have to do. And this is where precision conservation kind of comes in the middle and goes into focus on those two areas. So as I mentioned previously, this kind of traditional conservation enrollment, you have kind of a sporadic implementation, and that's again for various reasons. Some of that being limited conservation dollars that are allocated to certain areas. We don't obviously have an unlimited funding source to be able to implement conservation everywhere. And so one of my previous positions, I worked at Ducks Unlimited as a GIS technician, and one of our areas that we focused a lot on was trying to think about prioritizing areas. So we can think about where do we spread the limited resources that we do have as a group to have the best bang for the buck per se. So eventually we kind of moved towards this model of these kind of targeted, kind of incentive driven approach to putting conservation on the ground. But again, we do have limited manpower, money, and time. We can't do everything. And like I said, we don't have unlimited resources just to go out there and just put conservation everywhere in the landscape. And so we have to really think strategically about that. And so that's some of the work that my lab is actually currently working on and trying to find more strategic ways to implement conservation on the landscape, utilizing ideas like precision conservation. So as I mentioned, you have various constraints that really, really kind of influence, kind of like sideboards on what we can do as, say, an agency or a conservation organization. So how do we build towards a model of being able to identify strategically where we should implement conservation on the landscape? I know there's been a couple of different studies out there that have actually looked at this. One of those studies is based out of Missouri, the Missouri Department of Conservation and chapter of the Nature Conservancy actually implemented this work a while back and looking at for biodiversity conservation and private land parcels. And so Lee and Nee in 2011, they published a paper basically using a GIS-based conservation prioritization effort. And so essentially they had these various components in their model that basically dictated essentially where was the best bang for the buck. If you had limited resource and if you wanted to buy parcels up, or if you wanted to work strategically with landowners, where do you do that? And so this was a model that they implemented in Missouri to kind of look at where they should implement those conservation opportunity areas. And those are noted in the red areas. The blue areas were areas that essentially did not necessarily meet the model criteria as well as those areas were in the high. And so again, there's various components that go into that. And we're going to kind of build off of this effort for the work that my lab is actually doing. And so this is where this idea of precision conservation kind of comes into play. And it's really, in my mind, is a multi-scale approach. We would think more regionally. So from an agency side of things, if I'm looking at a region of the state, where do I focus? But then we also have to think about kind of that local, that field level focus. That is also a really key area that once we kind of identify those conservation opportunity areas, that we kind of drill into those specific parcels to implement conservation and work with those landowners. So some of the work that I've been part of through some of my colleagues here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln is we've been kind of thinking about this regional scale and building on some work out of Iowa State and basically looking at soil productivity through the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, building county level yield data, cash rental rate data, field input costs, et cetera. We basically took 10 counties here in southeast Nebraska. And these areas, we specifically looked at dryland corn acres in this case. And so this is basically 1 year data, so kind of take this with a grain of salt. But basically on our model, we were able to predict areas that are consistently losing money at just a regional scale. Now, obviously, there's going to be various factors that affect that at various scales. So you're just going to, again, you kind of take it with a grain of salt per se. But at least as we continue to build on this research, we actually have a PhD student starting here shortly who's going to expand on this research and actually figure out more effective ways to tie this data to yield monitor data and other factors that kind of influence that change from kind of a local to a regional scale, and being able to predict more precisely where at a regional scale we could target or kind of have kind of these opportunity areas, these conservation opportunity areas at a regional scale. We could then in turn more strategically send biologists to actually go out and meet with our landowners to kind of really, again, thinking about incentivizing and building that kind of that regional to local scale approach. So in this model, we can put all kinds of variables. I'm going to just talk about a handful. There is numerous ones. If you read the Lee and Nee paper, 2011, they have really multiple factors really go into that. I'm not going to go into all of them today, but you really can kind of think about this from a species of interest approach. And this is something that's a little different than the Lee and Nee approach. Really thinking about finding kind of these umbrella species that you can focus on. You can put in factors like land parcel size, suitable wildlife habitat, based on that species or those species of interest that you're very interested in managing for. You can put in other factors like proximity to urban centers if you're, say, managing for a game species and you want to be able to provide those resources on the landscape. And so one of the things that are missing on a lot of our prioritization tools is really species ecology. And obviously part of that is because we think, oh, well, there's a lot of species, how do we manage for all of them? But obviously, like I said earlier, we think about umbrella species. So you think about, say, pheasants. If you're managing habitat for pheasants, you're also having benefits to various other species like pollinators in the landscape. You have various small mammals that are on that will utilize those patches. So thinking about the kind of broad species ecology is really important. So you can factor in various things like dispersal and movement. So if those patches are too far apart on the landscape, then that's likely going to affect the species, basically the population growth over time. You can think about just, patch size. If there's certain patch size requirements for those species, that can go into the prioritization model. We can think kind of also about land cover data. If there's certain land covers that are more suitable for that species, we can factor that in as well. In addition, we can also tie in the data we talked about earlier in this agricultural data, thinking about these various factors. So our soil productivity, our input management costs for our farms. We can incorporate this into this framework. We can also incorporate in, like I mentioned earlier, distance to metro areas. If you're managing for, say, a game species and you want to find those areas that are, really close to those metro areas to really boost the chance you're going to have people traveling close to home that may not want to drive 3 to 4 hours away. Eventually, you get this nice, pretty map, very similar to what we talked about previously from the Missouri study. And this map basically will then kind of help in the prioritization for those biologists in the landscape, but at a regional scale, and really kind of pinpointing those potential areas that we need to focus on more strategically. And so another thing is we're, kind of, again, that's that regional scale, but like I mentioned earlier, we have to really focus on is that local scale. So we got to drill down into that local scale and basically build those connections at that level as well. So again, we go into a FSA office. This is a landowner going in, they want conservation implemented on the landscape. How do we do this? Well, there's some work from some of my colleagues out of Mississippi State University, Mark McConnell and Wes Berger, who've been actually adopting kind of this field level analysis. And eventually we can actually prioritize and basically identify those marginal acres utilizing yield monitor data and other data sources to actually identify these areas that are consistently marginal. So areas in this case here in this red, this is a cornfield out of North Dakota. These areas are basically consistently marginal. What we did is then we went over and we actually transitioned that into a pasture. So now we are actually increasing that whole field profitability for that field. So again, the point is that's a way we can leverage the technology at that local field scale. And I could go into a whole nother presentation on this and kind of the details and what goes into building these models at this local scale. But essentially what we're able to do is really maximize that return on investment for those producers while increasing the wildlife habitat or those benefits to the natural resources. We can also incorporate other options in here, thinking about grazing acres on those properties that I mentioned earlier. It can benefit pollinators if we take and manage that in a way more strategically to benefit various other species. Cover crops, again, hunting leases. There's various other ways you can incorporate in to kind of as a revenue stream to boost the overall profitability of that field. So another key component that I wanted to mention to you, and we just started a study here recently, is it also requires obviously producer relations. That's really critical. And so there's been a few different studies that have looked at this. We actually just started a study here. I have 2 graduate students that started working on this. And we're looking at farmers and farmland owners' attitudes to targeted conservation delivery. And so this is going to be a large scale study of about 7,500 mail surveys going out in the next couple of years, and really understanding some of the challenges that landowners face with adopting conservation practices and how can we all work together as a team on the landscape. And so I kind of envision this as kind of transitioning from a traditional conservation enrollment model of kind of that this shotgun pattern approach to more of a conservation cooperative approach, and how we work collectively with our neighbors to kind of see this ripple in the pond effect on the landscape. So to kind of finish up here in the last couple of slides, I wanted to kind of sum up what we just talked about and really think about these kind of 2 different scales. So that regional scale, we can think about improving patch connectivity for wildlife across the board, thinking about corridor establishment. We can also think about reducing the resources in a way of more targeting those financial resources more strategically by identifying those parcels that meet our requirements in the landscape. And then we can also think kind of that local scale, reducing habitat loss. By adopting these conservation strategies more strategically, we can kind of think about reducing that fragmentation across the board. It's never going to be perfect, but again, it's a way, it's a tool to be able to do that. And then lastly, I think one of the most important aspects, especially trying to get increased adoption, is those increased profits. If we can work with our producers more strategically to adopt these practices, we can actually help them increase the whole field and the whole farm profitability across the board, which is a great way to create those win-win solutions. So with that, I will leave my contact information for anybody that has questions, wants to email me later on. And if there is any time for questions, I will take and answer those.